Donovan Carter had been the minister of this small church for several years. The parishioners appreciated him for his professionalism and responsible attitude to his duties. But the most interesting thing was that some 10 years ago, Mr. Carter didn't even think about connecting his life with church or religion. As a graduate of the Yale School of Medicine, Donovan worked as a surgeon in a prominent hospital, which was rightfully considered the best in the state. Life seemed so predictable that the young surgeon naively believed that it would always be that way. Having achieved respect and financial stability, Donovan basked in the glory that his job gave him. He had everything a man of his age could ever dream of: a great job, a big house, and an expensive car. Everything changed one day in September when a bleeding young woman got into Donovan's OR. It wasn't a scheduled surgery since the patient got into a car accident and was literally carried into the hospital by the eyewitnesses of the tragedy. The woman had a damaged femoral artery, and so she needed immediate surgery. Donovan had no time to think, and he quickly started operating. Of course, it might have been a bit reckless and hasty on his part, but there was simply no other possible course of action at the time. Unfortunately, despite the young surgeon's best efforts, he couldn't save the patient. Everyone knew perfectly well that the young surgeon did everything right and that the woman's death wasn't his fault. She died of extensive blood loss. The problems began when the husband of the deceased patient came to Donovan's house and accused him of his wife's death. Trying to justify himself, the young surgeon didn't even realize how the verbal abuse turned into physical. It all ended with the fact that Donovan had to call the police and the grieving husband had been taken to the police station. This incident made the young surgeon doubt himself and look at the situation from a different angle. Donovan started thinking that it was actually him who was responsible for the death of the young patient, and not the unfortunate confluence of events. Moreover, the young surgeon started seeing the deceased woman in his dreams, which couldn't but affect his mental state. At first, the man stopped believing in his own talent and started refusing to perform complex surgeries. Trying to deal with the situation, Donovan didn't think of anything better than to look for solace at the bottom of a bottle. Over time, this led to the fact that the young surgeon had to quit his job. Donovan's life went downhill from there, and those whom he considered his friends turned their backs on him and betrayed him. Suffering from the feeling of guilt, the man slowly sank into the abyss of alcohol-induced nightmares and prolonged depression. And when it seemed that there was no way out of his predicament, a rather shabby copy of the Bible fell into his hands. For some inexplicable reason, the man started reading it. Every page he turned made him delve deeper into the essence of its teachings. Having converted, Donovan decided to become a minister. Of course, to do so, the man had to go through a seminary and get ordained. And now, 10 years after those tragic events, Donovan worked as a church minister in a small town in southern Connecticut. The minister sold his house and his car a long time ago and settled in a small cottage located within walking distance from the church entrusted to him. Local residents loved Mr. Carter and saw him as a great example of unshakable faith and indomitable spirit. Turning to Donovan for any reason, the parishioners knew that they would always get qualified help as well as valuable advice, which is so important in difficult life situations. They all needed different things. For some, it was to go to confession. For others, to finally come to their first Sunday service. But they all needed help, and the former surgeon understood it like no one else. Having nearly become the personification of faith for his parishioners, Donovan realized that he had chosen the right path in life. Thus, when he was asked to read a prayer over a deceased woman, the minister couldn't refuse. Donovan believed that leading a person on their last journey was a very responsible and extremely important mission. Therefore, when the husband of the deceased woman approached him, the minister readily agreed to help him. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. The beautiful coffin with the body of the deceased woman was brought to the church for the minister to read a prayer over it. But when it turned out that the deceased was brought to him from another city, Donovan got alert. Why on earth would her husband hold the funeral in our town then? Something is clearly off here. But what? The minister caught himself thinking. Donovan got even more suspicious when he saw the deceased during the ceremony. The woman was no more than 30 years old, and her skin seemed to exude freshness and youth. So young, what happened to her? Donovan thought, shivering. But most of all, the priest was surprised that only a few people were present at the funeral of the young woman. Only 4 people came to see the deceased off on her last journey, one of whom was her husband. 2 other women that were present were the deceased woman's best friends. For reasons unknown to Donovan, it was the presence of the 4th member of this funeral procession that alerted him. The thing was that the priest had already met him before. It was Charles Brown, who also worked as a surgeon at one point in his life. The minister knew very well that Charles was never a great surgeon. He remembered his former colleague to be pathologically greedy, to the point that he could do virtually anything for an extra $100. It was even rumored that Charles forged medical reports and performed surgeries at his own house. But being naturally cautious and cunning, the surgeon was never caught red-handed and thus never had problems with the law. And what is he doing at the funeral? Is the dead woman related to him somehow? No, it doesn't look like it. I remember Charles saying that he came from Utah and that all of his relatives lived there. Donovan thought, deliberately reading the prayer slower than he usually would have. It was clear that Charles Brown had recognized his former colleague, but chose to pretend that they didn't know each other. Realizing that something was off, Donovan decided to play for time and take a closer look at the deceased. Continuing to read the prayer, he came closer and saw something that made his heart start beating anxiously. The fact was that during the transportation of the coffin, the clothes of the deceased woman shifted slightly, causing a part of her belly to be exposed. Being an experienced surgeon, Donovan was well aware of the fact that in the event of death, an autopsy would be required to document this unfortunate event. To the priest's great surprise, there were no characteristic surgical sutures on the woman's body, which indicated that an autopsy hadn't been performed. God, what are they up to? Donovan thought once again and furtively glanced at the husband of the deceased, who was standing next to Charles Brown and quietly talking to him. Unlike the woman's crying friends, there wasn't a single tear on the face of either of the men. Donovan moved in closer and, to his surprise, noticed that the woman's chest was moving slightly. At that moment, the minister realized that he had unwittingly become part of a cunning scam where he was assigned a part to play. Well, no, that won't work, Donovan whispered, gritting his teeth. Having finished reading the prayer, he approached the friends of the deceased woman and addressed one of them in an undertone. "Give me a mirror, ma'am, but do it quietly. Don't attract any attention." However, despite Donovan's best efforts not to alert the men, Charles Brown and his companion were getting noticeably wary. True fear immediately appeared in the eyes of the men, which convinced the minister that he was right in his assumptions. And when Donovan brought the mirror to the mouth of the deceased, its surface got instantly covered with perspiration, indicating that the woman was still breathing. What's going on here? That woman is clearly alive. She's probably just in a medically induced sleep. The thought flashed through the minister's mind. At this moment, the minister looked at the frightened conspirators and commanded, "Stay where you are. It's all over." But Charles Brown and the husband of the alleged deceased woman didn't want to wait around and rushed to get out of the church, pushing each other on their way out. Meanwhile, Donovan went up to the woman and, having checked her pulse, started giving her CPR. Her astonished friends were screaming in fear, still unable to figure out what was happening. Since they didn't have any medical experience, they simply thought that the minister had lost his mind. But when the woman shuddered and took a deep breath, their surprise knew no bounds. Meanwhile, Donovan took out his phone and called the ambulance. The former surgeon knew that the woman wasn't in any particular danger, but he also knew that it would be better if she stayed under observation for some time. Then, Donovan called the local police and reported the situation, as well as provided a detailed description of the men. Charles Brown and his accomplice were detained by evening. As it turned out later, the woman saved by the minister was Jane Miller, and her husband was Arthur Ramirez. They got married just a year ago, but from the first days of their marriage, they realized that they weren't a good match. Never-ending fights and constant nagging had become the companions of this young couple. The situation was aggravated by the fact that Jane was the daughter of a wealthy landowner who left her a huge inheritance. That was what attracted Arthur to her in the first place. All he ever wanted was to spend his free time in restaurants and casinos. It's hard to say how the man came across Charles Brown, who was considered an unsurpassed master of medical falsifications and scams in certain circles. In any case, it was him that Arthur Ramirez turned to with his awful request. Meanwhile, the cunning swindler promised the dishonest surgeon a good percentage of the fortune of his rich wife. Of course, Arthur could have simply filed for divorce and sued his wife for his share of the assets. There was one catch. He signed a prenup when they were getting married, and thus he didn't have the right to make any claims in the event of their divorce. Therefore, Arthur decided to go with a different way and came up with the terrible plan to get rid of his wife. With the help of Charles Brown, he got his hands on the pills that would put Jane into a deep sleep. Then the surgeon used his connections and helped Arthur avoid the mandatory autopsy and medical examination of the corpse. For the same reason, the conspirators decided to bury Jane in a small town so as to not draw unnecessary attention to this event. It would seem that the criminals foresaw every little thing, but they made a mistake, which they couldn't have actually predicted. After all, there was no way for them to know that it would be Donovan Carter, a former surgeon, who would turn out to be the minister of the local church. Now, Charles and Arthur are facing trial for attempted murder and fraud. Of course, they are unlikely to get sentenced to much time, but at least Charles would definitely lose his medical license forever. And Arthur won't be able to enjoy as much female attention anymore, because even when he gets out of prison, he will always be an ex-con. Meanwhile, Donovan decided to continue serving at the church to the delight of his parishioners. After the incident with Jane, people believed in the power of religion, and the fame of the minister's miraculous abilities spread far beyond the state. Donovan only chuckles in response and doesn't stop repeating that everything happens by the will of God and that he is no magician, but just an instrument in the hands of the Lord.